The summer heat hung heavy over Carter Ridge Ranch as James Holt wiped sweat from his weathered brow. At 53, his body bore the marks of decades working the land. Hands calloused from fence mending, shoulders permanently hunched from baling hay, face lined and leathered from years under the Montana sun. The isolation suited him. He preferred the company of his horses and cattle to people, having retreated to this remote property following his wife Sarah's death 8 years ago. The locals in Blackwater County had learned to leave him be, save for the occasional supply run into town where he'd exchange as few words as possible before heading back to his sanctuary. Today the mercury had climbed past 95 degrees by noon, unusual even for July in this part of Montana. The drought had been brutal this season, turning fields brittle and forcing James to venture farther along the Blackwater River to check water levels for his livestock. His old mare, Penny, picked her way carefully down the eroded riverbank, sensing her rider's concern as they passed dry patches where water normally flowed. As the sun began its descent behind the distant Bridger Mountains, casting long shadows across the valley, something caught his eye, a metallic glint by the riverbank that didn't belong among the natural browns and greens of the landscape. In his experience, anything out of place in these parts usually meant trouble. James dismounted, wincing as his bad knee protested the movement. "Wait here, girl," he murmured to Penny, tying her reins to a sturdy cottonwood branch. He approached cautiously, one hand resting instinctively on the hunting knife at his belt, boots crunching on the dry, cracked soil. What he found stopped him cold. Hidden among dense brush and partly submerged in the riverbank mud was a large metal cage, the kind used for transporting large dogs or livestock. But inside, a young woman. She was huddled in a corner, her clothes dirty and torn, dark hair matted with mud and what looked distressingly like dried blood. A plastic water bottle, nearly empty, lay on its side near her feet. When she saw James, her eyes, large and dark, widened with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. She couldn't have been more than 20, probably a college student from the university in Bozeman. "Jesus Christ," James muttered, kneeling down to her level, the shock of finding a caged human being temporarily overwhelming his usual social reticence. "Who did this to you?" She didn't speak, only stared at him with wary eyes, shrinking back slightly when he moved closer. Her silence spoke volumes about the trauma she'd endured. The padlock securing the cage was heavy-duty, impossible to break without tools. Night was approaching and they were miles from his ranch house. James glanced around, suddenly aware that whoever had done this might still be nearby. The river here marked the boundary between his land and property owned by Westland Development, a corporate entity that had been buying up ranches across the state for years, with plans for luxury homes and a golf course. "I'm going to help you," James said firmly, making a decision. "I'll be back with tools at midnight." Fewer people around then. He wasn't sure if she understood, but he needed to be careful. The cage was positioned in a way that suggested its occupant wasn't meant to be found, at least not alive. He unscrewed his canteen and pushed it through the bars along with the sandwich from his saddlebag. "I promise I'll come back," he said, the words feeling strange in his mouth after years of speaking to almost no one. "My name's James Holt. My ranch is about 5 miles north of here." For a moment he thought she might speak, her cracked lips parting slightly, but then she just reached for the water with trembling hands. As James rode back to his ranch, his mind raced with questions. Who was she? How long had she been there? And most importantly, who had imprisoned her, and were they still nearby? The sun was setting quickly now, painting the sky in blazing oranges and reds that normally would have given him pause to appreciate, but tonight held only urgency as shadows lengthened across the valley. Back at his ranch house, a sturdy 2-story structure built by his grandfather in the 1940s, James paced the worn floorboards of his living room, the ceiling fan spinning lazily overhead doing little to dispel the evening heat. Penny was fed and stabled, but James couldn't settle. The logical thing would be to call Sheriff Dawson. But Tom Dawson was cousins with half the county and drinking buddies with the other half. News traveled fast in small towns, and James had learned years ago that local authorities weren't always reliable when it came to matters involving powerful interests like Westland. In the kitchen he pulled out an old topographical map of the county, spreading it across the table and marking with a red X where he'd found the cage. It was right on the border between his property and the vast holdings of Westland Development. Their security teams regularly patrolled the boundaries, claiming to prevent trespassing but really pressuring holdouts like James to sell. He'd had run-ins with them before, finding cut fences, missing cattle, and once a mysteriously poisoned well that had cost him a small fortune to repair. His hands shook slightly as he loaded his father's old .38 revolver, a precaution he hadn't taken in years. The weight of it felt foreign and unwelcome, a reminder of a world beyond his peaceful routine of dawn chores and dusk rounds. The girl's terrified eyes haunted him as he checked each bullet. He'd recognized something in them, the same trapped desperation he'd felt after losing Sarah to cancer. 4 months after her death, he'd felt like he was suffocating, caged by grief in a world suddenly turned hostile and meaningless. James checked his watch, 10:30 p.m. He gathered bolt cutters, water, a blanket, and a first aid kit from the barn. Whatever trouble he might be walking into, he couldn't leave her there. For the first time in years, someone needed him. The thought was both terrifying and strangely invigorating. His neighbor Ellie Chin, a retired nurse who'd moved from San Francisco 5 years ago, had become his reluctant connection to the outside world, dropping by occasionally with supplies and conversation he pretended to avoid but secretly appreciated. She'd lost her husband around the same time James had lost Sarah, though she'd handled grief differently, reaching out instead of withdrawing. "Isolation is slow poison," she told him once. "Trust me, I tried it too." James considered calling her but decided against it. The fewer people involved, the safer for everyone. But he scribbled a note with the cage's location and sealed it in an envelope marked with Ellie's name, insurance in case he didn't return. He left it propped against his coffee pot, where she'd find it when she inevitably stopped by to check on him in the morning. As midnight approached, James loaded his pickup truck rather than taking Penny. He might need to make a quick escape, and the old truck could handle the rough terrain better than a horse with 2 riders. The ranch's security cameras caught his departure, a recent addition after several suspicious incidents near his property line. James had never considered himself paranoid until Westland arrived, but now the cameras seemed prescient. The drive to the river seemed endless, his headlights cutting through the darkness of country roads that wound through pine forests and open meadows. James rehearsed what he would say to the girl, how he would approach without frightening her further. It had been so long since he'd had to comfort another person. Sarah had always been the people person between them, smoothing his rough edges with her easy laugh and gentle touch. Without her, he'd let those social muscles atrophy. The stars overhead were brilliant in the clear Montana night, the Milky Way a dusty streak across the black canvas. James took it as a good sign. No clouds meant better visibility. He parked a quarter-mile from where the main road neared the river, killing the engine and sitting in silence for a moment, listening for any signs of other vehicles or movement. Only the soft chirp of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl broke the stillness. James killed the truck's lights half a mile from the riverbank, continuing on foot with a flashlight dimmed by a red filter, an old hunter's trick to preserve night vision. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone intimately familiar with the land, avoiding dry branches and loose stones that might give away his approach. The night was alive with sounds, crickets chirping, the gentle rush of the river, the occasional rustle of nocturnal creatures in the underbrush, and his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The waning gibbous moon provided just enough light to navigate by, and James kept to the shadows of cottonwood trees that lined the river. The cage came into view, illuminated by moonlight reflecting off the water. She was still there, now sitting upright, alert to his approach. "It's just me," James whispered, approaching slowly with his hands visible. "I'm going to get you out." Up close he could see she was younger than he'd first thought, early 20s at most. Her dark hair was tangled with twigs and dirt, and dried blood streaked her temple where a nasty gash had begun to scab over. Her clothes, jeans and what had once been a blue t-shirt, were filthy and torn at the shoulder. When he approached, she backed away, pressing herself against the far side of the cage. "I won't hurt you," he said, keeping his voice low and steady, the way he'd talk to a spooked horse. "My name's James. I have tools to break the lock." He worked quickly with the bolt cutters, trying to minimize noise. The metallic snap of the lock breaking echoed loudly in the night. Too loudly. James froze, scanning the darkness around them, the weight of the revolver heavy in his jacket pocket. When the lock fell away, he pulled the cage door open. "Can you walk?" She nodded, attempting to stand but stumbling immediately, her legs unsteady from days of confinement. Without thinking, James reached in to support her, and she flinched violently at his touch, a small sound of fear escaping her throat. "Sorry," he murmured, backing away. "Take your time." She emerged slowly, like a wounded animal, eyes constantly darting to the surrounding woods as if expecting attackers to materialize from the shadows. James offered the blanket, which she wrapped tightly around herself despite the warm night, seeking comfort more than warmth. "River's rising," he observed, noticing how much higher the water was compared to earlier that day. The cage was now halfway submerged. Another day and this spot might have been underwater. A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond the riverbank. They both tensed, the girl's breathing quickening audibly. "We need to go," James whispered. "My truck's not far. Can I help you?" This time when he offered his arm, she took it, her grip surprisingly strong for someone in her condition. They moved through the darkness together, James constantly scanning their surroundings, alert to any sign of pursuit. They were halfway to the truck when headlights swept across the distant road. A vehicle moving slowly, searchlights extending from its windows, scanning the riverbank methodically. "Down," James hissed, pulling them both into the tall grass that bordered a drainage ditch. The girl didn't make a sound, her breathing shallow and controlled, suggesting this wasn't her first time hiding from pursuers. The vehicle, a black SUV with Westland security markings, passed slowly. James recognized the driver through the windshield. Roy Mercer, Westland's head of security, a former state trooper with a reputation for bending rules to get results. James had crossed paths with him twice before at town meetings, where Mercer had been the smiling face of Westland's community outreach, though his eyes had remained cold and calculating. Only when the taillights disappeared around a bend did James help her up. "Let's move. Quickly now." They reached his truck without further incident. As they drove away, James watched the rearview mirror, taking a circuitous route back to his ranch through fire roads and logging trails rarely used by anyone but local ranchers. The girl sat silently beside him, staring straight ahead, her face illuminated by the dashboard lights, revealing a determined jawline and intelligent eyes that seemed to be calculating something. "You're safe now," James said, though he wasn't entirely sure it was true. "I promise." She turned to look at him then, studying his face as if assessing the weight of his promise. After a long moment she spoke, her voice hoarse but steady. "Thank you." Those two simple words hung in the cab of the truck, the first acknowledgement of the strange bond now forming between them, rescuer and rescued, both out of their depth but committed to the path ahead. Dawn broke over the ranch as James finished securing the perimeter. He'd activated rarely used security measures. Motion sensors along the driveway and cameras covering the approaches to the house. Inside, the girl, who had finally told him her name was Maya Patel, sat at his kitchen table, clean clothes hanging loosely on her thin frame. James had found some of Sarah's old things in a box he'd never been able to bring himself to donate, and though they were a bit large on Maya's smaller frame, they were clean and whole. Ellie Chen had arrived an hour earlier, responding to James's urgent call with medical supplies and no questions asked, at least not until she'd examined Maya's injuries, dehydration, malnutrition, bruised ribs, and a gash on her temple that needed proper cleaning and butterfly bandages. "She needs a hospital, James," Ellie had whispered in the hallway, her no-nonsense nurse's demeanor at odds with the concern in her eyes. "Not yet," he'd responded. "Give her time. It's not just physical." Now, with Ellie preparing food in the kitchen, something with ginger and garlic that filled the house with unfamiliar but comforting aromas, Maya finally began to speak. Her voice was raspy from disuse, but her words were precise, educated. "I was documenting environmental violations," she explained, hands wrapped around a mug of tea as if drawing strength from its warmth. "I'm a journalism student at Montana State University. There were rumors about Westland contaminating the river, using chemicals for their new development that weren't approved by the EPA. Agricultural runoff is one thing, but this was industrial-grade stuff." James nodded. He'd suspected as much. His cattle had been getting sick after drinking from certain stretches of the river over the past year, and the fish population had mysteriously declined. "I took water samples, had evidence," Maya continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "Before they caught me, I was able to document traces of chromium and arsenic levels way above legal limits. Then these men caught me on what they said was private property. They took my samples, my phone, everything." Her eyes darkened with the memory. "Said they were just going to scare me, keep me overnight." Her voice cracked. "That was 4 days ago." Ellie's hand flew to her mouth. "My God." "It was Mercer," Maya said, her voice hardening. "Westland's security chief. He's the one who put me in that cage. Said he was teaching me a lesson about trespassing." She met James's eyes directly. "But it wasn't their land. I checked the county records. That section of riverbank is actually part of state land, a conservation easement." James exchanged glances with Ellie. Roy Mercer had connections throughout the county, including with Sheriff Dawson. They'd been seen sharing drinks at the Broken Spur bar in town, heads close in conversation. "They never meant to let me go," Maya said quietly, staring into her tea. "I heard them talking when they thought I was asleep. The river's rising because they're releasing water from the reservoir upstream, part of their development plan. The cage would have been underwater by morning. The implication hung heavy in the room. This wasn't just illegal imprisonment, it was attempted murder. We need evidence, James said finally, breaking the silence. Without it, it's your word against Mercer's and in this county. He didn't need to finish the thought. Maya looked up, determination replacing fear in her eyes. My backpack. They threw it in the river, but it got caught on some branches about a quarter-mile downstream. I saw it when they were moving me. It has my camera. Waterproof case. James stood, decision made. I know that stretch of river. If it's there, I'll find it. Not alone, Ellie said firmly, setting down a plate of food in front of Maya. I'm calling my nephew. Miguel's a lawyer in Bozeman, specializes in environmental cases. He needs to know about this before we go to any authorities. As plans formed around her, James watched Maya, her shoulders straighter now, strength returning with each bite of food and sip of tea. He recognized the look of someone who'd been broken but was finding the pieces of themselves again. He knew that journey all too well. Outside the window, dust rose from the driveway. A vehicle was approaching. The black SUV stopped at the gate to James's ranch, not attempting to breach the property line but making its presence known. Through binoculars, James could see Roy Mercer and another Westland security guard scanning the property from the road. Mercer's face was set in lines of barely contained anger, his jaw working as he spoke into a radio. They're looking for her, James said, lowering the binoculars. But they can't come in without a warrant. Miguel Ortiz, Ellie's nephew, closed his laptop. At 35, he had the confident bearing of someone used to courtrooms and boardrooms alike, his suit immaculate despite the early hour and the dusty ranch setting. We have enough for the state police. The photos Maya took of the chemical dumping, combined with her testimony about the abduction. It's not enough, Maya interrupted, her voice stronger after a night of rest and food. Mercer has friends in the department. They'll bury it just like they've buried complaints from other ranchers. I did my research, 3 separate reports about water contamination in the last year, all dismissed for lack of evidence. James watched the SUV circle his property, keeping outside the boundary but making its intentions clear. A vulture circling wounded prey. There's another way, he said quietly. My security cameras. They cover the property line along the river, including the state land. If they caught Mercer near that cage. For the first time since he'd installed the system, more out of paranoia than necessity, James was grateful for his caution. With Miguel's help, they accessed the footage from 3 days ago, searching through hours of recordings from multiple cameras. There it was, Mercer and 2 guards dragging something heavy toward the river. The timestamp matched Maya's account exactly. As they watched, Mercer's face was clearly visible as he secured the padlock on the cage, saying something to his companions that made them laugh. Send this to your contacts at the FBI field office in Bozeman, Miguel told James, his expression grim. This crosses state lines. They were dumping chemicals in a river that flows through 3 states. That makes it federal. Beyond Mercer's reach. James nodded, a plan taking shape. But first, let's make sure Mercer knows we have it. The next hour was a flurry of activity. Miguel making calls, Ellie preparing documentation of Maya's injuries, and James retrieving the backpack from the river, finding it exactly where Maya had described. The camera inside was intact, its memory card a treasure trove of evidence, not just of the chemical dumping but of Westland's larger pattern of environmental destruction. 2 hours later, when state police cars and a single FBI vehicle rolled up his driveway, James stood on his porch, watching the black SUV that had remained parked on the public road. As Mercer was handcuffed and led to a police car, his eyes locked with James's across the distance. A look of pure hatred that would have once made James retreat further into isolation. But now, with Maya standing beside him and Ellie and Miguel nearby, the look held no power. James simply nodded once, acknowledging the moment for what it was, the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. In the following days, the story exploded across local and then national news. Westland Development stock plummeted as investigations revealed a pattern of environmental violations and intimidation tactics against landowners. Maya's journalism professor helped her develop the story into a series that would eventually win a student journalism award. 3 months later, James sat on his porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold. The charges against Mercer and Westland executives were proceeding, with Maya's testimony as a cornerstone of the case. Miguel had helped James file his own lawsuit against the company for the contamination of his land. The sound of tires on gravel announced visitors. Maya stepped out of Ellie's car, looking healthier than she had when she left for her parents' home in Seattle weeks ago. Her hair was cut shorter now, framing a face that had regained its color and vitality. She carried a leather messenger bag emblazoned with the Montana State University logo. "I wanted you to be the first to know," she said, settling into the rocking chair beside him on the porch, a spot that had once been Sarah's favorite. "I'm transferring to Montana State. Finishing my degree here." James nodded, something like pride warming his chest. "Good land here. Worth protecting." "That's why I came back," Maya said, pulling a folder from her bag. "Someone needs to tell its stories. And I've got a new one." She handed him a printout of an article from the Bozeman Chronicle. The headline read, "Federal Investigation Expands, Westland Tied to Similar Cases in 3 States." James scanned the article, noting how many of the quotes came from sources close to the investigation. He recognized Miguel's careful phrasing in some of them. "This is bigger than just our river," Maya explained, her eyes bright with purpose. "They've been doing this for years, buying up land, contaminating water sources, then selling the properties at a loss to shell companies that mysteriously avoid environmental cleanup responsibility." "And you're going to keep digging," James said. It wasn't a question. "With some help," she confirmed. "My professor set up an independent study. I'll be documenting the whole case through to the trial." She paused, suddenly hesitant. "That's actually why I'm here. I was hoping I could use your ranch as a base sometimes. For the research." The request hung in the air between them. 6 months ago, James would have refused outright, guarding his solitude like a miser with gold. But that was before finding a caged young woman had forced him to reconnect with the world. "The old bunkhouse by the east pasture," he said finally. "It needs work, but it's got a solid roof. Could be fixed up as a kind of office, I suppose." Maya's smile was worth every inch of privacy he was surrendering. "I'll only be underfoot occasionally," she promised. "And I'll help with the horses when I'm here." As darkness fell over the ranch, lights came on in the guest house where Ellie had taken up semi-permanent residence, claiming James needed someone to keep him civilized. The ranch that had for years been his solitary refuge was now occasionally filled with voices. Miguel discussing legal strategies at the kitchen table, Ellie fussing about his eating habits and bringing over dishes that introduced spices he'd never encountered, Maya interviewing him about the history of the valley for her articles. "There's something else," Maya said, her expression turning serious. "The FBI agent handling the case called today. They found evidence that Westland has been targeting other whistleblowers. Not just environmental activists but former employees too. 3 people missing in the last 2 years, all with connections to Westland projects." James's jaw tightened. "Mercer? Him and others? They're building a RICO case now, organized criminal conspiracy." She looked out across the darkening pastures. "The agent said if you hadn't found me when you did." She didn't need to finish the thought. James had revisited the scene 2 days after the rescue. The cage had been completely submerged. "You found yourself," James said gruffly, uncomfortable with being cast as a hero. "I just provided transportation." Maya laughed, the sound still somewhat new to the ranch's quiet atmosphere. "Is that what we're calling bolt cutters these days? Transportation?" The teasing caught him off guard, a good sign he supposed. Trauma never really left, he knew from experience, but it could become something you carried rather than something that defined you. The isolation that had once been his comfort now seemed like a prison he'd built for himself. In freeing Maya from her cage, James had somehow unlocked his own. "You know," he said quietly, "I've been thinking about those north pastures. Good grazing land going to waste." Maya smiled, understanding the unspoken invitation. "I might know some environmental science students looking for research opportunities. There's been talk about restoring native grasses along watersheds." James nodded, watching the stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. For the first time in years, the future stretched before him not as an empty road but as a path with footprints alongside his own. "Sarah would have liked you," he said suddenly, surprising himself with the admission. He almost never spoke of his wife aloud. Maya didn't respond immediately, respecting the weight of the statement. Finally she said, "Tell me about her?" And so, as the night deepened around them, James began to speak about Sarah. Her laugh, her stubbornness, her passion for the land they'd worked together. Words came haltingly at first, then more freely, stories he hadn't allowed himself to revisit for nearly a decade. In the distance, a coyote called to its pack, the sound echoing across the valley. Another answered, then another, separate voices becoming a chorus. James fell silent, listening to the wild conversation. Life finds a way, Maya observed quietly. Even after the worst happens. James thought about the woman beside him, who had survived being caged and nearly drowned. About Ellie, who had lost her husband but built a new life 3,000 miles from everything familiar. About himself, finally emerging from the cage of grief he'd constructed. Yeah, he agreed, his voice rough with emotion. Reckon it does. The night air carried the scent of pine and sage, the river's distant murmur a reminder of both danger and renewal. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, depositions, interviews, the ongoing fight against Westland's army of lawyers. But tonight, sitting on his porch with a young woman who had somehow become important to him, James felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope, fragile but persistent, like the first green shoots after a wildfire. The land knew how to heal itself, given time and care. Perhaps people weren't so different. You know what Sarah used to say? James looked out at his ranch, silver-tinged in the moonlight. She'd say, the land remembers what we do to it. Good or bad. Smart woman, Maya said. Smartest I ever knew, James agreed. Until recently, anyway. Maya ducked her head, but not before he caught her pleased smile. They fell into comfortable silence, two people connected by circumstance but choosing to remain connected by something more. In the morning, they would continue their separate battles against the forces threatening this place they both had come to love. But for now they simply sat together under the endless Montana sky, bearing witness to the simple miracle of survival. Cages opened, isolation ended, and life, against all odds, finding its way forward.